The lights burned hot overhead, turning the studio into a simmering stage of tension. Though the air conditioning hummed a cold, sterile rhythm beneath it all, Joy Behar sat comfortably in her chair on the set of The View, her red hair swept up, her eyes glinting with that usual cocktail of sarcasm and certainty. Across from her, seated squarely under the scrutiny of 5 women and an audience ready to react at every syllable, sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, stoic, folksy, but with a sharpness in his eyes that suggested more than the drawl in his voice might betray. Outside, Manhattan was busy peeling itself off the edge of summer. The streets pulsed with honking horns, impatient heels clacking across sidewalks, and steam rising from hot asphalt. But inside the studio, a storm was brewing that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with pride, values, and one unlikely confrontation that would leave millions stunned and one host silenced in a way no one saw coming. Joy Behar, known for her biting wit and progressive stance, had been preparing for this moment all week. Behind the scenes, she'd studied Kennedy's speeches, scribbled notes in the margins of briefing papers, and practiced her questions like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. Her motivation wasn't rooted in malice, not exactly, but in the belief that voices like Kennedy's, steeped in old-school charm and conservative rhetoric, needed to be challenged, publicly and forcefully. Senator John Neely Kennedy, for his part, had grown up along the back roads of Mississippi and Louisiana, raised on grit and gospel, taught to respect his elders, and never speak when he had nothing worth saying. After years of service, both as Louisiana's state treasurer and then as senator, he'd built a reputation for colorful quips and unpredictable votes, often disarming his opponents with humor before landing a point that cut deep. Beneath the twang, he was sharp, a former Oxford scholar with more books than boots in his house back in St. Tammany Parish. And he knew what was coming. The segment began like any other, a warm introduction, a few polite jabs, light laughter. Joy asked about his latest policy proposals. He answered with deliberate charm, always managing to turn a question into a parable. But then, it shifted. Her tone sharpened. She leaned in. The audience, sensing blood in the water, grew quiet. "You talk a lot about protecting the Constitution," Joy said, her voice rising ever so slightly. "But how can someone who claims to defend American values continue to support candidates and policies that clearly discriminate against vulnerable groups?" There it was. The question hung heavy, and a few audience members murmured their approval. Kennedy paused. For a long time, he looked down at his hands-calloused, thick-fingered hands that still trembled a bit after too much caffeine or too little rest. And then he looked up, slowly. "Well, Miss Joy," he began, his voice low and even. "You say you want to have a conversation, but I get the feeling you came here to deliver a monologue. That's your right, of course, it's your show. But you asked me a real question, and I'm fixing to give you a real answer." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, Kennedy told a story. He spoke about a woman named Clara, a black schoolteacher from Opelousas, Louisiana, who had written to him after the hurricane floods, begging for help, not just for disaster relief, but for safety from escalating street crime. He told the audience how he flew down without cameras, walked with her through the broken sidewalks of her neighborhood, and saw firsthand what fear looked like in a mother's eyes. "I may be a Republican," he said quietly, "but my job's not to represent a party, it's to represent people, and people don't come in neat little boxes of left and right. They come with stories, pain, hope, and whether I agree with them or not, I listen." For a moment, the room was still. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy held up a hand, not rudely, but gently, like a teacher signaling a class not to interrupt. "And about them values you're talking about," he continued. "I believe in protecting the unborn, but I also believe in feeding the hungry. I believe in the Second Amendment, but I also believe in mental health care. I believe in faith, yes ma'am, but I also believe in reason. What I don't believe in is shaming people into silence just because they see the world different from you." And just like that, something shifted. But that wasn't the end. The moment went viral, of course. Clips of Joy blinking in stunned silence ran across every major outlet. But what didn't make the headlines? Not at first were the quiet ripples that followed. A week later, Kennedy received a handwritten letter not from Joy, but from one of the producers of the show. A young woman named Eliza, who grew up in the Bronx and had always believed she knew where she stood politically. But watching Kennedy speak with humility and seeing how he turned an attempted ambush into a moment of grace stirred something in her. Her father, a war vet with opposing views, had stopped speaking to her after a political argument 2 years prior. After the show, she called him. They talked for 2 hours. Meanwhile, back in Louisiana, Kennedy returned to his routine. Committee meetings, town halls. He didn't bask in the attention, but something had shifted in him too. That encounter tense raw, public had exposed a deeper ache he rarely showed. For years, he'd buried frustration beneath wit and folksy wisdom. He was tired of the labels, tired of being reduced to soundbites and stereotypes. He wanted to start listening more and, not just to his supporters, and Joy. Well, that night after the show, she sat alone in her dressing room longer than usual. The mirror before her didn't offer answers, but she wasn't angry. She was thoughtful. She replayed his words. For all their differences, there was something in Kennedy she respected: his refusal to take the bait, his unflinching calm, the way he seemed to speak not from a strategy, but from his soul. 2 weeks later, in an unscripted moment on The View, Joy mentioned his name. "You know," she said with a chuckle, "I may not agree with Senator Kennedy on much, but I have to say, I've thought about what he said. And maybe he's right about one thing: we've all stopped listening." The room was quiet again. But this time, it felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. In the months that followed, Kennedy would go on to propose a bipartisan mentorship program for young staffers on Capitol Hill, pairing people from opposite sides of the aisle to shadow each other for 6 weeks. It didn't make national news, but it made a difference, and for Joy, it sparked a subtle shift. She didn't change her views, but she began inviting more unexpected voices to the table: authors, teachers, even veterans with varied perspectives. Not to trap them, but to listen. Really listen. Because sometimes, the most powerful moment isn't when someone wins an argument. It's when they change a conversation. In a time when division had become the currency of fame, one soft-spoken man with a southern drawl reminded America of something easily forgotten. That dignity doesn't require agreement. That courage can be quiet. And that sometimes, the most disarming answer is not a rebuttal, but a story told with heart. So what did Senator Kennedy do after Joy Behar tried to humiliate him? He stayed calm, he told the truth, and he left her and millions of others not silenced, but speechless. Because when the noise fades and the applause dies down, what we remember isn't who shouted the loudest, it's who spoke with grace.